Daniel Cooper had never considered himself a suspicious husband. During the 9 years he and Rachel had been married, trust had never been something they needed to discuss. It was simply part of their life together. They lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Nashville with their 6-year-old daughter, Lily, whose laughter filled every corner of the small brick house they had bought shortly before she was born. Their days were ordinary in the best possible way. Daniel worked as an electrician for a local contractor, leaving home before sunrise most mornings. Rachel worked as a registered nurse at one of the city's busiest hospitals. Their schedules were demanding, but they had learned how to make them fit together. Breakfasts were rushed, dinners were rarely fancy, and weekends belonged entirely to family. Every Saturday they visited the farmers' market downtown before taking Lily to the nearby park, where she insisted on feeding ducks even after being told countless times that bread wasn't good for them. Rachel always carried a small bag of birdseed in her purse instead. It was one of those tiny habits Daniel loved, because it reminded him how naturally she cared for everyone around her. Friends often described Rachel as the kind of person who could never ignore someone in need. She remembered the names of elderly patients long after they had left the hospital, volunteered at community blood drives, and somehow found the energy to comfort worried families even after working 12-hour shifts. Daniel admired that part of her, though he sometimes worried she gave too much of herself away. Rachel always laughed whenever he mentioned it, insisting that kindness wasn't something that could run out. Then, almost without warning, their routine began to change. It started with one late evening. Rachel called shortly before the end of her shift and explained that the emergency department was overwhelmed after a highway accident. Daniel understood immediately. Hospitals couldn't close because someone's schedule ended. He picked up Lily from school, prepared dinner, and left Rachel's portion warming in the oven. She arrived home after 10 o'clock looking exhausted. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep, and she barely touched her food before falling asleep on the couch. The next week it happened again. This time Rachel blamed staff shortages. 2 nurses had called in sick and everyone else had stayed longer to cover the extra patients. Daniel didn't question it. He had seen news reports about hospitals struggling with staffing for months. A few late nights didn't seem unusual, but the pattern continued. Days turned into weeks. Rachel was almost never home before 9 in the evening. Sometimes she arrived after Lily was already asleep. Other nights she quietly kissed her daughter on the forehead before standing alone in the kitchen for several minutes as though trying to gather enough strength to smile. Daniel noticed changes that were harder to explain. Rachel began leaving her phone inside her locker at work instead of carrying it with her. When he called, the calls almost always went unanswered until much later. She seemed distracted during conversations, occasionally staring out the window without realizing anyone was speaking to her. Once, while folding laundry together, Daniel noticed fresh tear stains on one of her uniform tops. Rachel quickly claimed a difficult patient had passed away that morning. Daniel believed her because that answer fit the woman he knew, yet something inside him whispered that there was more she wasn't saying. One Thursday evening, Lily waited by the living room window with a drawing she had made at school. She wanted to show her mother before bedtime. 8 o'clock passed, then 9. Eventually Daniel carried the sleeping child to bed with the folded drawing still clutched in her small hand. Rachel came home nearly an hour later. She quietly picked up the picture from Lily's bedroom floor and sat beside the bed longer than usual. Daniel watched from the hallway as Rachel brushed a strand of hair away from their daughter's face. For a brief moment he thought he heard her whisper an apology. The following Saturday, while cleaning Rachel's car before taking Lily to soccer practice, Daniel found a crumpled receipt tucked beneath the passenger seat. It was from a small neighborhood grocery store on the opposite side of Nashville. The purchase included bread, milk, soup, fresh fruit, bottled water, and several prescription items. Daniel frowned. Rachel had never mentioned stopping there. The location wasn't anywhere near the hospital. He slipped the receipt into his pocket, telling himself there was probably a simple explanation. Yet that evening, as Rachel once again arrived home long after dark with tired eyes and an exhausted smile, Daniel found himself looking at her differently for the first time since the day they had met. Not with anger, not with distrust, but with a question that refused to leave his mind. Where was she really spending those missing hours? Daniel tried to ignore the receipt for several days. Every time he thought about asking Rachel, he found another reason to stay quiet. She looked exhausted enough already. The dark circles beneath her eyes grew deeper each week, and she had started falling asleep on the couch almost every evening before dinner. Lily noticed it too. One night she quietly covered her mother with a blanket before whispering that nurses must get tired from taking care of everyone else's families. Daniel smiled, but the words stayed with him long after Lily had gone to bed. The following Tuesday, Rachel texted shortly before 6 o'clock saying she would be working another double shift. Daniel wasn't surprised anymore. He prepared dinner for himself and Lily, cleaned the kitchen, and waited. Around 9, he glanced at the hospital's employee parking app, something Rachel had once shown him when she forgot where she had parked after a long shift. Her car wasn't listed in the employee garage. At first, he assumed the system was delayed. 20 minutes later, it still showed nothing. He immediately felt guilty for checking in the first place. Trust wasn't supposed to look like this. The next afternoon, Daniel stopped by the hospital to surprise Rachel with coffee. The receptionist smiled politely before checking the staff schedule. Rachel had clocked out almost an hour earlier. Daniel stood frozen for several seconds. According to her last message, she was still working overtime. He thanked the receptionist, returned to his truck, and sat without starting the engine. For the first time, the possibility he had refused to consider quietly entered his mind. That evening, Rachel arrived home carrying takeout for the family. She apologized for being late again and explained that paperwork had delayed everyone after shift change. Daniel wanted to tell her where he had been. Instead, he nodded and pretended everything was normal. Lying awake beside her later that night, he realized something had changed inside him. He no longer questioned whether Rachel was hiding something. He only wondered what it was. 2 days later, he made a decision he immediately regretted. After finishing work early, he parked several blocks from the hospital and waited. At a little after 5, Rachel walked out wearing jeans and a gray sweater instead of her nursing uniform. She climbed into her car and drove away. Daniel stayed far enough behind that she never noticed him. She didn't head toward home. She crossed downtown Nashville before turning into an older neighborhood he had visited only once years earlier. The streets grew quieter, the houses smaller. Finally, Rachel pulled into the parking lot of a neighborhood grocery store. Daniel watched from across the street as she filled a shopping cart with bags of groceries, bottled water, cleaning supplies, and several prescription medications. They were almost identical to the items listed on the receipt he had found. She paid with her own bank card, loaded everything into the trunk, and drove away again. Daniel followed until traffic separated them at a busy intersection. By the time he reached the next light, Rachel's car had disappeared. He drove home feeling worse than before. Nothing he had seen looked like an affair, but it also wasn't overtime at the hospital. When Rachel came through the front door later that night, she hugged Lily, asked about school, kissed Daniel on the cheek, and thanked him for making dinner. She acted exactly as she always had. Daniel forced himself to smile back. He hated the fact that he had spent the evening following his own wife through the city. A week passed before he tried again. This time he was more careful. Rachel left the hospital shortly after 5, stopped at the same grocery store, and then continued into a quiet residential neighborhood filled with small houses built decades earlier. She parked in front of a weathered white home with an overgrown yard. An elderly man slowly opened the front door before she even knocked. Rachel carried the grocery bags inside as though she had done it many times before. 20 minutes later, the curtains shifted slightly. Daniel could see Rachel sitting across from the old man at a small kitchen table. She reached across and gently held his hand while speaking to him. The older man lowered his head and Rachel quietly squeezed his hand without letting go. Daniel couldn't hear a single word. He didn't need to. From where he sat, it looked painfully intimate. His chest tightened. Every explanation he had searched for over the past month suddenly disappeared. He started the truck, drove away before Rachel came outside, and spent the entire drive home trying to convince himself that what he had seen couldn't possibly mean what it looked like. Daniel barely spoke the rest of the evening. Rachel noticed immediately that something was wrong, but he blamed a difficult day at work and avoided eye contact whenever she looked at him. After Lily fell asleep, Rachel sat beside him on the living room couch and gently asked whether he wanted to talk. For a brief moment, Daniel almost told her everything. He almost admitted that he had followed her, that he had seen the small house, the groceries, and the elderly man whose hand she had held with such tenderness. Instead, he quietly shook his head and said he was simply tired. Rachel accepted the answer without another question, but Daniel noticed disappointment in her eyes before she walked upstairs. The following morning, he couldn't concentrate at work. Every electrical panel, every blueprint, every conversation with his coworkers blurred together. The image of Rachel sitting across from the old man refused to leave his mind. By lunchtime, he had convinced himself there had to be an explanation. By the end of the afternoon, he was certain there wasn't. He returned to the neighborhood after work, parking several houses away from the white home. The curtains were open. The elderly man sat alone in a worn recliner watching television. Rachel wasn't there. Daniel watched for almost an hour before finally driving away. On Saturday morning, Rachel announced she needed to cover another shift because several nurses had called in sick again. Daniel smiled politely and wished her a good day. 20 minutes after she left, he followed once more. This time there was no stop at the hospital after her shift ended. She drove directly to the grocery store, bought fresh vegetables, soup, bread, and medication, then continued to the same White House. Daniel remained hidden across the street. He watched Rachel unlock the front door with a key. His heart sank. She no longer looked like someone making an occasional visit. She looked like someone who belonged there. Nearly 2 hours passed before she came back outside carrying an empty laundry basket. She loaded it into the trunk, smiled toward the front window, and drove away. Daniel waited another 10 minutes before approaching the house himself. He didn't knock. He simply stood near the sidewalk looking at the small front porch. An old wooden rocking chair moved gently in the wind. Beside the door stood several flower pots filled with fresh yellow daisies. One of them had clearly been planted only recently. Daniel turned away before anyone noticed him. That evening, Rachel arrived home exhausted but strangely peaceful. She laughed with Lily during dinner, helped her finish a school project, and even suggested watching a movie together before bedtime. Daniel forced himself to act normally, but every smile felt heavier than the one before. Around midnight, unable to sleep, he quietly searched through public property records online. The small house belonged to a man named Thomas Bennett, 74 years old, widowed, no listed family members. Daniel searched social media, newspaper archives, and public records, but found almost nothing beyond an old retirement announcement from a local manufacturing company nearly 15 years earlier. There was no connection to Rachel that he could find. 3 days later, Daniel made a decision he never imagined making. During his lunch break, he met with a family attorney. He didn't accuse Rachel of anything. He simply explained what he had seen. The attorney asked whether they had discussed counseling or whether Rachel had admitted to another relationship. Daniel quietly answered no. He had no proof of an affair, only unanswered questions and weeks of lies. The attorney handed him preliminary divorce paperwork explaining that nothing would happen unless Daniel chose to file. He carried the documents home inside his work bag and stared at them for hours after everyone had gone to sleep. The next evening, Rachel noticed the folder lying on the kitchen table. She opened it slowly. She didn't look angry. She didn't demand an explanation. She simply read every page in complete silence. When she finally looked up, tears were already running down her face. Daniel waited for her to deny everything, to tell him he had misunderstood, to explain the old man, the house, the groceries, and every late night. Rachel said nothing. She quietly picked up a pen and signed the last page. Before walking out of the kitchen, she whispered only one sentence. She hoped that one day he would understand why she had chosen silence. Daniel watched the front door close behind her. For the first time since they had met, he felt as though he had lost her. Even before the marriage had officially ended, the days that followed felt unreal. Rachel moved into the guest bedroom without arguing or trying to change Daniel's mind. They continued caring for Lily together, shared meals in uncomfortable silence, and spoke only about school schedules, work, and household responsibilities. Lily sensed the distance immediately. She stopped asking why her parents no longer laughed together and instead spent more time drawing quietly at the kitchen table. Daniel noticed the sadness in her eyes every time Rachel left for another late evening, yet Rachel never defended herself. She never mentioned the small white house or the elderly man. Her silence slowly convinced Daniel that he had already discovered the truth. A week later, while finishing an electrical repair across town, Daniel received an unexpected phone call from an unfamiliar number. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Dr. Melissa Grant, the nursing director at Rachel's hospital. Her voice was calm but unusually serious. She asked whether he could stop by the hospital after work because she needed to speak with him about Rachel. Daniel's first thought was that Rachel had finally admitted everything. By the time he arrived, he had prepared himself for almost any explanation. Dr. Grant welcomed him into a small office overlooking the hospital courtyard. She closed the door before quietly asking one question. Had something happened between him and Rachel? Daniel hesitated before admitting they had begun divorce proceedings. Dr. Grant lowered her eyes for a moment, then sighed. She explained that Rachel had never wanted anyone from the hospital involved in her personal life, but circumstances had changed. Daniel deserved to know the truth before making a decision he might regret forever. Dr. Grant opened a file and removed several documents. None of them were disciplinary reports or employment records. Instead, they described a community outreach program the hospital had quietly supported for years. The program paired volunteer nurses with elderly patients who had no remaining family members and were considered at high risk of isolation after discharge. Most volunteers visited once or twice each month. Rachel had volunteered almost every evening for more than 6 months. The name at the top of the file stopped Daniel cold. Thomas Bennett, the same man who lived in the White House. Dr. Grant explained that Thomas had lost his wife nearly 15 years earlier. His only son died in a military training accident several years after that. More recently, early-stage dementia had begun affecting his memory. Although he could still live independently, he frequently forgot to eat, skipped medication, and sometimes wandered outside during the night. Social workers had searched unsuccessfully for relatives willing to care for him. There were none. Rachel first met Thomas after he was admitted to the emergency department with severe dehydration and malnutrition. During his stay, he repeatedly asked whether someone could stay with him after discharge because he was afraid of dying alone in the house he had shared with his wife for 40 years. Hospital policy prevented staff from becoming personal caregivers. Rachel struggled with that rule after watching Thomas leave the hospital with no one waiting for him. Several days later, she used her own free time to check on him. Then she came back again and again. She bought groceries with her own money because Thomas often forgot to shop. She cooked simple meals, organized his medication, cleaned parts of the house that had become unsafe, and stayed until he fell asleep on nights when confusion became overwhelming. Dr. Grant looked directly at Daniel before speaking again. Rachel had never asked the hospital for reimbursement. She never told coworkers because she didn't want recognition. She only said that no one deserved to grow old believing the world had forgotten them. Daniel felt every assumption he had made collapsing around him. Then he quietly asked the question that hurt the most: if everything was innocent, why had Rachel lied? Dr. Grant didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened one final envelope Rachel had left with instructions to give Daniel only if he ever came looking for the truth. Inside was a handwritten letter. The first sentence made his hands begin to shake. "I knew that if you discovered how exhausted I had become, you would ask me to stop helping him, and I knew I wouldn't be able to." Daniel sat alone in Dr. Grant's office, unable to take his eyes off Rachel's letter. Every sentence made the weight on his chest feel heavier. Rachel explained that she had never meant to deceive him. At first, she truly believed she would only visit Thomas once or twice after his discharge from the hospital. But every time she prepared to leave, he asked the same heartbreaking question. He wanted to know whether she would come back tomorrow because he could never remember if anyone still cared enough to visit. Rachel wrote that she couldn't walk away from someone who had already lost everything. She knew Daniel's heart well enough to understand exactly what would happen if she told him. He would insist on helping. He would work longer hours to pay for professional care or spend every free evening repairing the old house himself. Eventually, both of them would become exhausted, and Lily would lose the little family time they still had together. Rachel decided to carry the burden alone. It was the wrong decision, she admitted, but it came from love rather than dishonesty. Daniel folded the letter slowly. For the first time in weeks, he realized Rachel had never been protecting a secret for herself. She had been protecting everyone else. Dr. Grant quietly suggested that before making any final decisions, Daniel should visit Thomas himself. She wrote an address on a small card and wished him good luck. The drive across Nashville felt longer than ever before. When Daniel finally reached the small white house, he sat inside his truck for several minutes before gathering the courage to knock. After a short delay, the front door opened. Thomas Bennett stood there wearing an old gray cardigan, his eyes searching Daniel's face with quiet confusion. Daniel introduced himself. The older man smiled politely and invited him inside without hesitation. The house was modest but spotless. Fresh groceries filled the kitchen shelves. Medication containers were neatly organized by day of the week. A repaired lamp stood beside the living room chair, its electrical cord carefully replaced. Daniel immediately recognized his own style of workmanship. Rachel had secretly asked one of his employees months earlier for advice on fixing it after noticing the damaged wiring. She had never mentioned it to him. While making tea, Thomas began speaking about Rachel. He never called her Nurse Cooper. He simply called her his guardian angel. He explained that after his wife died and his memory began fading, days often blended together until he no longer cared whether morning came. Then Rachel appeared. She brought groceries, cooked dinner, listened to stories he sometimes repeated 3 times in the same evening, and never once acted impatient. She celebrated his birthday even after he forgot it himself. At Christmas, she decorated the tiny living room because he no longer had the strength to carry boxes down from the attic. Daniel listened in silence. On a small bookshelf, he noticed dozens of photographs. Most were old family pictures. One stood apart from the others. It showed Thomas sitting on his front porch beside Rachel and Lily, both smiling at something outside the frame. Daniel had never seen the picture before. Thomas carefully picked it up and handed it to him. On the back, Rachel had written a single sentence: "No one should ever feel forgot." Before Daniel left, Thomas stopped him near the front door. His voice grew unusually clear, almost as though every trace of confusion had disappeared for a moment. He quietly thanked Daniel for sharing Rachel with someone who desperately needed kindness. Then he smiled sadly and admitted something Daniel would never forget. Rachel often spoke about her husband and daughter. She loved them more than anything else in the world. Every evening before leaving, she looked at the family photograph on her phone and whispered that she hoped they would forgive her one day for always coming home so late. Daniel walked back to his truck holding the photograph with trembling hands. For weeks he had believed he was losing his marriage because of another man. The truth was far more painful. He had almost destroyed it because the woman he loved had simply cared too deeply for someone the rest of the world had already forgotten. Daniel drove home with Rachel's letter resting on the passenger seat beside him. Every mile through Nashville replayed the past several weeks in his mind. The unanswered phone calls, the late evenings, the grocery receipts, the quiet tears she thought no one had noticed. He had spent so much time searching for signs of betrayal that he had completely missed the signs of exhaustion. When he reached home, Rachel was sitting alone on the back porch after putting Lily to bed. She looked up as he approached, already knowing where he had been. Before she could speak, Daniel quietly placed the letter on the table between them. For several seconds, neither of them said a word. Finally, Daniel admitted the hardest truth he had ever spoken. He hadn't lost trust because Rachel cared about another man. He had lost trust because they had stopped carrying life's burdens together. Rachel lowered her eyes and confessed that every lie had become heavier than the one before it. She had wanted to tell him countless times, but each passing week made the truth feel more impossible to explain. She believed protecting him from one burden would somehow keep the family safe. Instead, she had nearly destroyed the very family she was trying to protect. Daniel reached across the table and gently took her hand. He told her there would still be difficult conversations and rebuilding trust would take time, but he refused to let fear write the ending of their story. The following weekend, Daniel asked Rachel to take him back to Thomas's house. This time they arrived together. Thomas smiled the moment he opened the door, though it took him a few seconds to remember Daniel's name. Instead of awkwardness, the afternoon felt surprisingly natural. Daniel repaired loose steps on the front porch while Rachel prepared lunch inside. Lily spent hours planting flowers beside the walkway with Thomas, who proudly explained that yellow daisies had been his late wife's favorite. Before leaving, Daniel quietly looked around the aging house. The roof leaked in several places. The fence leaned dangerously toward the alley. Several windows needed replacing before winter. On Monday, he called 3 close friends from his construction crew. He never explained the entire story. He simply asked whether they would help an elderly widower who had no one left. None of them refused. The following Saturday, nearly 20 people arrived at Thomas's house. Electricians replaced old wiring. Roofers repaired damaged shingles. Neighbors brought furniture, groceries, blankets, and fresh paint. Someone planted a small vegetable garden in the backyard. Others rebuilt the front steps where Daniel had noticed the loose boards. Rachel stood quietly on the porch watching strangers work side by side. She had spent months believing she needed to carry every problem alone. Now she watched an entire community solve in one day what she could never have done by herself. Thomas walked slowly through the house that evening, stopping in every room as though he couldn't believe it still belonged to him. Before everyone left, he thanked each volunteer individually. When he reached Daniel, he smiled and said something that made the entire day worthwhile. He quietly admitted that for the first time since his wife died, the house no longer felt empty. Weeks later, Daniel officially withdrew the divorce papers. Healing wasn't immediate. Trust returned slowly, one honest conversation at a time. Rachel no longer hid where she was going. Daniel no longer assumed silence meant betrayal. Instead of trying to protect each other by carrying pain alone, they began facing it together. Lily noticed the difference before anyone else. One afternoon at school, her teacher asked every student to draw what family meant to them. Most children drew parents, siblings, or grandparents. Lily's picture showed 4 people standing together in front of a small white house surrounded by yellow flowers. When the teacher asked who the 4th person was, Lily smiled and answered that sometimes family was simply the person who needed someone to care enough to stay. Years later, Thomas's home became the center of a neighborhood volunteer program that helped elderly residents living alone. Daniel organized repair projects. Rachel coordinated medical visits and community support. Dozens of volunteers joined them over time, proving that kindness could spread much further than anyone expected. Visitors to the Cooper home often noticed a framed photograph hanging near the front door. It showed Daniel, Rachel, Lily, and Thomas laughing together on the rebuilt porch beneath a bright summer sky. Beneath the picture was a small handwritten sentence Rachel had copied from one of Thomas's old notes. The greatest mistake isn't believing the worst about someone you love. It's forgetting to ask them for the truth before deciding you've already found it.